Dienst. We are an information service for journalists specializing in the field of migration and asylum. Uh, Today, we have a lot to go through, and we have an absolutely great international panel that will help us uh, on our journey. So please let me introduce you to today's speakers. Without further ado, we have Syed Fahim Sadat, who was head of masters in international relations at Cavidan University in Kabul, as well as security and political analyst, among others, for the Afghan government. After the Taliban insurgents overthrew the government, he fled to Germany, where he is currently living. Welcome, Mr. Sadat. Then we have David Mansfield, who is an independent consultant with 25 years of experience working in Afghanistan. He has worked on drug trafficking, and more recently, but it's been several years, he conducted in-depth research on irregular migration. Welcome, Mr. Mansfield. And then we have Dr. Cavidan Soykan, who is an independent researcher based in Izmir in Turkey, specialized in the functioning of the Turkish asylum system and the rights and living conditions of refugees in Turkey, of course, among others, Syrian, Afghans, and Iraqis. And she's currently conducting researches on the living conditions of refugees, especially Afghan refugees in Eastern Turkey. So for those who know us, one of the main activities of the Mediendienst Integration is to draw attention to realities that aren't dominating the headlines or that have fallen out of the headlines. And well, it's hard to believe that today we are addressing exactly this kind of topic, because it's not even 1 year has passed since the harrowing images from Kabul airport, the images of women, children, and men desperately trying to escape the new Taliban regime by, in some cases, we've seen clinging to the undercarriage of planes at the airport. And these images, as I said, they're not even 1 year old. But many things have happened since then. And as it is often the case, the media have moved on. Most Afghan refugees, on the contrary, didn't have any opportunity to move on. So we know that several thousands people, maybe up to 100,000, have been evacuated, although it's pretty hard to tell how many and where they are. But there are still millions of Afghans who are trapped in desperate conditions. Just to summarize, but probably most of you are already familiar with the situation. After the Taliban took power and most international organizations left the country, Afghanistan plunged into one of the most harrowing economic and humanitarian crises of the last decades. According to the United Nations, about half of the population is suffering from malnutrition. Women and girls bear the brunt of this crisis since they were exposed to extreme violence, and they've been basically erased from public life, as Amnesty International stated in a report that came out just yesterday. And these conditions were made even worse by an earthquake that struck the country in June of this year. So, according to UNHCR, about 3.5 million people are internally displaced, and hundreds of thousands of Afghans left the country, most of them looking for shelter in Pakistan and Iran. The figures are very nebulous. We don't know exactly how many there are. And of course, we don't know where they are. One thing that we know is that Pakistan and Iran, who are the two countries that have hosted most Afghan refugees so far, have changed their policies. They've become more restrictive, and there have been instances of pushbacks and also violence and discrimination against Afghans. So, in the end, while only a few Afghan refugees could actually reach Europe, their plight is as real, if not even more real, than it was 12 months ago. So it's worthwhile to take a dive into the current situation, and our experts will help us do exactly that. And before I give the word to an expert who's also experienced the hardship of exile, in a moment, I just need to do a few technical remarks. First of all, our panelists will each give a 5-minute input in sequence, and everything that they say during these inputs can be quoted unless they explicitly tell us otherwise. And once we're through with the inputs, we'll start the question time. To ask your questions, please write them down in the chat box that you see it should be on the bottom right of the screen. And I'll read them for the panelists. Try to be as brief and clear as possible in the formulation of your questions. And one very important thing, Since some of the things that Mr. Mansfield is going to touch upon are highly sensitive information that could put people in Afghanistan at risk, I ask you to consider his answers during the question time as confidential or not meant for publication unless he tells us explicitly otherwise. So this is a very important thing. Please don't quote Mr. Mansfield without asking for permission. If you happen to drop out of the meeting, don't panic. Just find the email with the invitation, click again on the link or the green button, and you will be taken immediately to the room. So, without further ado, Mr. Sadat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabio. See, before the collapse of the republic was imminent, at least the government of Afghanistan tried at that time to diversify the routes of migration because the republic did not want like the major chunk of the people to go to Pakistan because of the geopolitical and geostrategic use of them by the Pakistan throughout the years that we have had the experience since 1979 when the first time migration happened to Pakistan. So in these new routes was the Central Asia and Turkey and also Iran also. But a lot of people or ordinary Afghans who could not afford a visa and living expenses in Central Asia, they did try to go back to Iran and Pakistan, but some number of people did go to Central Asia, particularly to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and they are living there, trying to make a way to a third country from there. And then some of the people before the collapse went to India. And a lot of the government officials and along with the people who could afford a living tried to place themselves in Turkey. But during the collapse and after the collapse of the republic, again, a major chunk of the people did go to Iran. There are reports that from 1,000 to 7,000 people could daily go to Iran. Although that the repatriation and the forced deportation continued, but that did not stop the people. And Zaranj, the capital of Nimroz, became the center of human trafficking and still remains so in Afghanistan. That is the place from where people are making it to first to Pakistan and then to Iran because that province borders both upon Pakistan and Iran. So right now I believe according to some data there are 1.5 to 2 million undocumented Afghans in Iran who are living in these refugee villages or the so-called village camps and also in rural and semi-urban areas. As I have talked to them, I have my relatives even who has been to Iran. The situation is not good. Not good because there is a constant fear of being deported, beaten, tortured, or jailed. But as looking back to the country, they are still trying to make it in Iran. The people who go to Iran basically there are three types of people who make it to Iran. The ones are to stay in Iran, and there are the others who would try to then cross to Turkey and stay in Turkey, and there are the ones who go to Iran in order to go to Turkey and finally make it to Europe. So it's a long journey. These three categories of people, amongst them, the ones who wants to go to Turkey and Europe are facing more barriers because of the Turkish restrictions on the border and making this new wall of 3 meters.
Mr. Sadat, just 1 second. Our colleague is writing that she cannot hear you properly. Can you just move a little closer to the microphone? Just a little.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and sorry for interrupting.
It's okay. And then there are people in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan too. They are still there, and of course a lot of people still went to Pakistan despite that Pakistan was restricting the movement. But some of the people who were particularly government officials this time did not prefer to go to Pakistan because there was a fear amongst them that looking at the good relationships or the complicated relationships between Pakistan and Taliban, they might be handed over to Taliban back in Pakistan. So they also preferred to go either to Turkey through Iran or go to Central Asia, but they did go to Turkey as long as I know a lot of them, and also try to move there. But of course, they had a very legal way of leaving the country because they had visas or they were sponsored. But the majority of the ordinary people did go to Iran because for various reasons, such as they knew that with the collapse of the republic and with the draining of the foreign donation, there's going to be rampant poverty, unemployment, and also the fear of uncertainty that what type of Taliban are we now facing? Is it the Taliban of 1996 or is it the Taliban of 2.5? Are they going to be harsh? Are they going to be revengeful? Or so this also made a lot of people to leave until to see what happens in the country, and that is why we had days where from 1,000 to almost 7,000 people did try to cross to Iran. And I think looking at the humanitarian catastrophe that followed after the Republic collapse, the flow of migrants to Iran is still continuing.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sadat. It's what you sketched in this brief input is a situation in which there are very different forms of migration. It's not one single migration from Afghanistan out of Afghanistan towards the country and then moving on, but there are different paths leading out. Now I would ask Mr. Mansfield to come back in because he will help us focus on what I think is the main route for people who have no other opportunities. They don't have strong ties to the West. They don't have people in Europe sponsoring them. They need to get out of the country. And as Mr. Sadat also said, they gather in places like Saranj, if I pronounce it correctly, to get out of the country in some way. And Mr. Mansfield, you've been researching exactly on the subject of how these routes evolved. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I'd like to, build on the great stuff Fahim's just input, but really focus down on one of the places he mentioned, which is Zaranj, and the focal point that plays in the people smuggling on the land route via Pakistan, typically into Iran and then on to Turkey. And we started this work late 18, early 2019 with that focal point, recognizing Zaranj as this hub for people smuggling. We've used a combination of fieldwork, interviewing migrants and people smugglers, but also high-resolution satellite imagery by which to identify some of the border structures that have been put in place and how that has reshaped smuggling routes over time. We've also used similar methods to look at what is happening on the Iranian-Turkish border, but also interviewed migrants in Europe, looking at how their experiences have changed over time. People who have arrived 5 years ago versus 4 years ago versus 3 years ago, how those routes, the costs, the conditions, the journeys that they endure. So I'll just sketch that route briefly in relation to that of Zaranj. As I say, Zaranj is the focal point for irregular migrants, and the hotels in the city really operate as the market hubs. It's at the hotels, and there's countless, hundreds, where migrants collect to arrange their onward journey, initially to Tehran, sometimes as far as Istanbul, rarely on all the way to Europe. The land route is typically arranged one leg at a time. It's a staccato journey as a function of cost, risk, and cash flow of the migrants. These are some of the most marginal migrants. These are not people with good connections or have worked for embassies, etc. Many of these hotels are named after provinces from where the owner originates and where he draws his links, and offers small payments to people to facilitate sending people to his hotel from their home provinces. In the past, what we found was it was more of a free market. Migrants would often go directly to the villages on the Iranian border and be escorted across by people who had relatives on the other side of the border, and it's fairly free flow. That really changed with the development, with the arrival of the Afghan Republic, and then the strengthening of the border management, particularly by the Iranians, but also by the Afghans, including the introduction of visas. Then, of course, it was the construction of the Iranian government's construction of a border wall. 35 kilometers to the north and south of Zaranj, completion of the fence, particularly important in changing the way migrants traveled. That wall raised the challenges and risks of going directly into Iran. Getting shot at is not uncommon for those making that hazardous journey. Concentrated the people smuggling industry in the city of Zaranj itself, and largely rerouted people south. So people look at Zaranj and they think, oh, it's a hop, skip, and a jump across the Iranian border. No, most of them are traveling directly south through the deserts and subsequently into Pakistan, and then from Pakistan moving across across to the Iranian border. And there's a big gap in the fence that allows that to take place. So, and it's from there they take the onward journey to Tehran, may settle for a period of time. We've found that that's less so in the last year because the Iranian economy is so decimated. But they typically pass on into Tehran, arrange their next part of their journey, move on to West Azerbaijan, and as no doubt Cavidan will talk about, a lot of them congregate in Van for onward travel to Istanbul. So the changes we've seen. I mean, I think we've got, in terms of the numbers departing, more than doubling from the previous peak of 2014-15, when, you know, many people smugglers talk about the days when Europe was open. It was a heyday, the golden years. We've got a doubling from that in terms of the numbers leaving Zaranj. When we were doing our work, March, May 2019, about 70 to 80 pickups per day leaving. Each pickup carries 20 to 22 people, depending if families are there. But by March 21, numbers were climbing with Biden's announcement that US forces, NATO were leaving. We got up to 200 to 350 pickups a day leaving Zaranj, okay? What we also began to hear was that a growing number of these migrants were from the Afghan National Police and the Afghan National Army. So these were the very people who were meant to defend the Afghan state in the face of NATO withdrawal, were leaving March, April, May, before actual withdrawal had been completed. The numbers kept escalating. By the time the Taliban was at the doors of the city of Zaranj, which was the first provincial capital to fall, there were 500 pickups leaving a day. That's 10,000 people. And following the capture, we had the days where there were 700 to 800 pickups. So the numbers are just increasing and increasing. There was a bit of a respite in September, October. Border was closed. Dak, the village on the border where essentially pickups drop off from Zaranj, pickups come in from the Iran-Pakistan border, collect people and then take them that way, had no more capacity to hold people. So the border was closed for about 3 weeks. And then on one day, we've got the videos, we've got imagery, we've got this congregation of vehicles. There were 1,600 vehicles that left that day. That's 32,000 people. We estimate in October alone, there were 350,000 people leaving. So we have this big, massive pickup. We also see an unseasonal variation. Normally, the numbers leaving Zaranj dissipate during the winter. It's a tough journey across the mountains of Pakistan into Iran. It's an even tougher one from Iran in Turkey, but people still kept coming 4 times more than the previous winter. So we've had this large number of people leaving over the last more than 18 months. As I say, it was before the Taliban takeover, it started. But more recently, the Taliban seems to be trying to reduce the numbers of departures, even closing the major car park where people depart from in Zaranj. In terms of the routes, largely unchanged, typically 2 routes out of Zaranj. Primary route is south to Dak, as I mentioned, Pakistan. There's also a route directly across the wall. And this has become increasingly popular for the Hazara minority. It's a dangerous route, incurs higher costs. And as I say, you will get the potential of getting shot at. But many Hazaras prefer to do this because of the risk of going south into Pakistan. They also face the risk of Jundullah, the Sunni opposition party to the Shia government and they have captured people, they have tortured people, and we have some of our interviewees who have experienced forced labor, etc. there. So the routes largely have not changed. In terms of the costs, not always easy to judge because every journey is negotiated differently. And it's the conditions by which some people travel. There's the luxury game versus where you get official paperwork, etc. You might get Iranian border passes or paperwork that means that you can cross more easily. There's all sorts of deals there that are struck between individuals. But typically the cost to Tehran from Zaranj is around up to $350, depending on the route. $350 by the wall, $250 by DAC. Depends again, as I say, kind of food and accommodation. But during the Republic, the prices were more like $200. So there is an increase, but it considering the cost of living and the rise in fuel prices, etc., it's not dramatic. It's a further $750 to $1,500 from Tehran to Turkey. Again, it has been increasing, can get up to over $2,000 if you want official paperwork, which means that you don't have to take these hazardous mountain routes, particularly in the snow. What we've really seen in Afghanistan is a massive reduction in the transaction costs associated with the people smuggling business. In the past, during the Republic, there were a lot of monies collected by corrupt officials at the hotels in Zaranj, in the village of Masumabad in the south of the city, where migrants concentrated to get a pickup to the desert to back. In the district centre in Charbajak, where you get a boat across the Helmand River, there was all sorts of payments being made. And until recently, under the Taliban, there was just one payment at the car park in Zaranj, which is almost like the formal departure lounge for migrants now. What we have seen, rather than rising costs, is how the conditions of travel have deteriorated significantly for migrants over the last 18 months. In the past, in Iran, you see about 5 people would travel in one of these Renault Persians. In the last 18 months, it's been more like, and certainly in the last 12 months, it's been more like 15. It's amazing how many people you can get in a car, particularly when it's still only one person in the front seat. So you've got 5 people in the boot, 10 people on the back seat. The accommodation, I'm sure Cavidan will talk about this, the conditions that people are living in Tehran and in Van, where they, again, congregate. Rooms that used to accommodate dormitories, about 20 people, now got 50 and more people. The food is appalling that they're being given. This is really difficult journeys. And in part, this is an effort to reduce the costs incurred by the smuggler. But it's also to handle the sheer numbers that are of people who are en route. You have to remember the smugglers want to push people through quickly so they can get paid. So it's about pushing this volume. We've also seen a rise in the number of families traveling, even in the winter months, through deep snow on the Iran-Turkey border. Just look at some of the stuff on TikTok and various other things where people smugglers advertise their journeys. It further highlights the fact that young families with children are traveling through these deep snows, just how deep the economic crisis in Afghanistan. And again, we'll hear more about this next. Growing reports of these pushbacks, not arrests and detentions. There's violence on the borders en route as law enforcement officials try to keep the number of migrants entering their countries down, but actually only serve to delay entry until another day. Again, the way the people smuggling business is structured. In fact, we're now seeing a growing number of people accumulating downstream, with reports of significant numbers of Afghans accumulating in Tehran, part of the winter backlog who did not want to cross during winter, the Turkish border in winter, and in places like Belgrade as they arrange their onward travel to Europe. And what I would argue is we should anticipate, if the economic crisis in Afghanistan deteriorates even further, especially if the Taliban actually enforces a ban on drugs, as they have intimated, many more people will be on the move in the coming months. Mm-hmm. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mansfield. You drew a picture that is very as vast as it is complex. And you mentioned the fact that it's just the first leg of the trip for most people, getting to Tehran and then moving on to the next the next hub, which is usually Van in Turkey, and then we take it from here with Dr. Soykan. You've been working in that region. Can you tell us what you've heard from Afghan refugees and how things have changed over the last few months?
Thank you. Maybe first I should mention that Turkey is going through before an election period. We are expecting having general elections and the presidency elections next year. The official date is June 2023, but we are having a real deep economic crisis, and not only Turkish citizens but also migrants and refugees heavily being affected by this crisis. For example, just like a quick note, the official statistics is for the inflation rate is over 70%, but we know that this is not the real number. It's actually over 100% right now, and we are expecting a deteriorating economy towards the fall. So in these conditions, there is this discourse between the opposition parties and the AKP. And unfortunately, both sides are turned to scapegoating refugees for the Turkey's economic problems. For example, just half an hour ago on TV live, there was the one of the board members of the main opposition party, Republican party's JP's, one of the MPs, and she's responsible from the human rights. And I'm in contact with her. I'm trying to explain the situation on the ground. But unfortunately, I think until the elections, we will not have a real discussion based on numbers and the real situation on the ground. So when I go back to your question, maybe I should tell that since the 2016, Turkey's migration policy completely changed. It was not actually based on human rights or fundamental rights or refugee rights, but we had a failed coup attempt. And then in the same year, we had this deal, the statement with the European Union, readmission agreement with Greece. So since then, actually, the policy changed, but it's officially changed when the Directorate of General Migration Management was turned into Migration Management Presidency last October with a decree, presidential decree. So it has a very large authority on migration and migration management. And it was we had a new law, first law, asylum law on 2013 for the first time. We had a civil authority to manage migration in Turkey. And last April, we had the 10th year of the acceptance of the law. So they start using the name, the Presidents of Migration Management, and they change the discourse. If you go to their Twitter account, you will see it's very interesting that the new slogan is Turkey is managing migration. But how Turkey is managing migration is, like, you will see weekly small videos like reels. And yesterday I just checked. So it counts every day how many migrants, irregular migrants captured, how many migrants stopped at the borders, how many migrants daily put into detention, how many migrants daily deported, how many migrants daily returned. So like you can see these numbers daily on the Twitter account, but nothing nowhere else. Like if you go to their website, you can't find any information or anything else. But on the Twitter account, it's like they declared a war against migrants. So I just checked that, as I said yesterday, for example, between 15 to 21st of July, it said that more than 5,000 people, migrants were captured, and nearly 2,000 out of this number were Afghans. So right now, the biggest group either stopped at the borders, Iranian border, or within the country are Afghans. And it's quite interesting, as we talked between us before this meeting. You asked me whether Turkey has an official agreement with the either before with the Afghan Republic or the Taliban. And I checked, there is no readmission agreement actually signed, like there is no official document. And Turkey declared that they stopped returns after the Taliban came to power, took over the power. But interestingly, starting from this January, Turkey started its own so-called voluntary return program to Afghanistan. And I can give you some numbers. For example, it said on the Twitter account again, more than 25,000 irregular migrants were sent back to Turkey with 140 charter flights since January 2022. It says again on the Twitter account. So it's like, as I said, the opposition party is blaming AKP that there is no migration policy and economy is so bad that Turkey needs to start a fight against irregular migration. They repeat this discourse maybe every week. Just I saw on TV an hour ago by the an MP responsible from the human rights, and then as a response, AKP is using this very harsh measurements and policy against migrants. And again, for example, as I said on the Twitter account, you can find these information. The Minister of Interior is now have the power over this presidency, because it changed from a directorate to presidency. It's directly connected to the Minister of Interior and directed to the Erdogan. So, for example, as I said, it was like a few days before the World Refugee Day. They had this big meeting, Turkey's new migration policy meeting, but it was only online, on Twitter, nowhere else. And they said that we have a new, renewed migration policy, but it was all about the returns, deportations, stops, apprehensions. It's all about that. It was like when you listen to it, it's like, wow, they are like fighting against terrorists. It's not like fighting against irregular migration. So the Minister of Interior, Mr. Soylu, said since 2016, as I said, I always said that, I claim that as an academic, 2016 was the year everything changed. Since 2016, he said, more than 2 million people, irregular migrants, stopped at the Iranian border. Since 2016 again, he said, within Turkey, more than 1.4 million people were apprehended. And the capacity of return centers was extended to 20,000 with the EU funding. And for example, right now, more than 18,000 people in return centers. And last month, towards the end of last month, I was invited to Izmir Bar for the World Refugee Day, but like as a week, we had events here. And that week, there were like irregular migrants, mostly Afghans, in the return center here in Izmir. And the lawyer friends I know, they had their asylum applicants, helping asylum applicants. But suddenly at night, usually it's after midnight, they take people by bus, and they take them to the airport without notifying their lawyers or without notifying anyone. And Izmir Bar lawyers rushed to the return center to stop the returns, but they could not manage. And even they were like had ill treatment when they tried to help their, the applicants. And that week, I have the number, more than 250 irregular migrants, they say, Afghans, were returned back to Turkey. They always use this language. We return them back to their countries. And they claim that it's a voluntary return program initiated by Turkey. But the problem is these people really want to access to asylum or protection in Turkey. And currently, the first group who needs protection in Turkey, Afghans. When we look at the international protection applications, the biggest group, Afghans. But the number the new presidents receive as asylum applications is so low. It's down to 20,000. And it's impossible, while like millions of people are trying to cross through Turkey, and some of them are, even if they were apprehended or put into detention, they want to seek asylum here, but they are not allowed. For example, they only stay like a few nights in a detention center, mostly here in Izmir or Edirne, or I saw like different numbers when I watched these like small clips on Twitter. Like in even the eastern part of Turkey, we have new return centers. They're actually immigration detention centers, and they just send them back like in a night, in a few days. Like they have no access to legal aid, lawyers, or the system. So that's the biggest problem right now. Maybe I can stop here.